Living in a country where nearly 1/3 of the territory is deadly desert and billions of tons of sand are swallowing farmland every year, China has created an unprecedented miracle, planting more than 66 billion trees to transform some of the harshest lands on Earth into a billion-dollar agricultural ecosystem. This is not only a battle against desertification, but also an effort to revive deserts into massive green oases, where farms, modern solar power plants, and new cities grow together. So how were Chinese farmers able to turn dead land into places producing millions of tons of food every year? Join Agriculture Insight as we explore the story behind this extraordinary achievement. China did not conquer the desert because it was easy. They did it because there was no other choice. The greatest paradox of Western China is that the place harsh enough to challenge every limit of cultivation is also the very place this nation of 1.4 billion people must connect at all costs. But why is that? Stretching from the Gobi Desert to the Taklamakan Desert, China possesses one of the largest arid belts in the world, with total desert and desertified land reaching nearly 2.6 million square kilometers, equal to 4 times the size of Texas. Some areas receive less than 100 millimeters of rainfall per year, with extreme day-to-night temperature swings of nearly 80 degrees Celsius, while sandstorms bury roads within hours. But the greatest threat was not that the desert existed, but that it kept expanding. For decades, sand continuously advanced into farmland, villages, and northern economic corridors, creating massive dust storms that reached as far as Beijing, South Korea, and the skies of East Asia every spring. However, in the land where many nations saw nothing but hot, useless sand, Beijing saw vast land reserves, thousands of sunshine hours each year, and nearly limitless solar energy potential. Beneath that sand also lay more than 16 billion tons of oil, 16 trillion cubic meters of natural gas, along with minerals and a strategic corridor linking China with the rest of Central Asia. In other words, this was not just a desert, it was a colossal energy vault locked away by geography. At the same time, it was strategic land capable of absorbing population pressure, becoming a vital link in China's ambition to compete for global leadership. That is why China launched an unprecedented greening campaign, stopping desertification, channeling water across arid land, then transforming nearly 65,000 square kilometers of some of the most barren terrain into green oases capable of producing more than 30 million tons of agricultural products every year. And to understand how such a miracle could exist, we must begin with the first step, forcing billions of tons of sand to stand still before planting the very first seed. This battle did not begin with trees, but with understanding how the desert moves. Across the Taklamakan Desert, survey teams were deployed for months, using high-resolution satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and thousands of wind measurements to analyze sand movement patterns, wind speed, and the terrain structure beneath the surface. The goal was not simply to observe the desert, but to read how it operates. Once the dynamic mapping was completed, the first step began, leveling the desert. Hundreds of bulldozers and heavy machines were deployed to cut down high dunes, move and redistribute enormous volumes of sand into lower areas, creating a relatively flat and uniform surface. This was not an immediate process of building farmland, but of removing extreme terrain instability, turning a chaotic environment into ground stable enough for human intervention. Only then did the sand control phase truly begin, and the real line of defense came from a solution that seemed primitive: dry straw. Tens of millions of tons of post-harvest straw from nearby agricultural regions were collected, compressed into bales, then transported by trucks and freight trains to the desert edge. There, it was cut into sections around 20 to 30 centimeters long, deep enough to anchor into the sand while still maintaining stable grip on the surface. Across thousands of square kilometers of scorching sand, workers inserted bundles of straw into the desert surface, forming a regular grid of squares measuring about 1 meter on each side. This structure, commonly known as the checkerboard barrier, became one of the most effective sand control systems ever deployed on a large scale anywhere in the world. When wind races close to the ground, this is where it carries the most sand. But when it strikes these small straw grids, the airflow is split, slowed, and loses kinetic energy. Sand particles that were moving begin to fall, trapped inside each square instead of continuing onward. After weeks, millions of small cells connect into one enormous mesh, turning a constantly shifting ocean of sand into a more stable surface. But the real importance of this system was not only keeping sand in place. It also reduced water evaporation, retained moisture more effectively, and created microclimates mild enough for drought-resistant shrubs to take root. That was the first turning point of the entire project. The checkerboard locked sand on the surface, but to keep the desert stable for years, China needed a stronger biological defensive line to hold the sand from below. From large-scale nurseries built along the desert edge, tens of millions of young seedlings, after being cared for through the earliest stage of life, were transported into the open sands. In many areas, each planting pit was dug by farmers to a depth of around 40 to 80 centimeters, allowing roots to reach the more stable sand layers below. What made this process different was that the bottom of each pit was then filled with 5 to 15 kilograms of organic fertilizer, moisture-retaining materials, and biological mulch to reduce water loss during the early stage. Once the seedlings were placed into the ground, drip irrigation systems delivered water directly to the root zone at a flow rate of only around 2 to 8 liters per hour, instead of wetting the entire surface like traditional flood irrigation. By sending water precisely where the plant needed it most, this method could reduce water use by roughly 30 to 60%, a critical factor in places where every drop was once considered a luxury. Most ordinary plant species would die within weeks from desert heat shock, so saxaul, tamarisk, drought-tolerant poplar, and many native shrubs were prioritized for their ability to survive the harshest conditions. But once the first roots penetrated deep into the ground, the balance began to shift. Roots bound loose sand particles together, trunks broke the wind, canopies retained moisture, and fallen leaves gradually created organic matter on the surface. Season after season, places once covered by bare sand began to form living soil. The first years were the most difficult stage, when seedling mortality rates in many areas could reach as high as 80%. Caused by a single major windstorm or one extreme summer. That is why China invested around 14 billion USD across multiple phases of national anti-desertification programs, while total maintenance costs are estimated to have exceeded 50 billion USD from 1978 to today. Few countries have attempted environmental restoration on this scale. More than 66 billion trees have been planted over decades, alongside over 500,000 kilometers of green belts, shelter forests, and new vegetation spreading along the edges of the largest deserts. From this point on, the battle was no longer only about surviving a brutal ocean of sand. It was about turning the desert into a new food machine of the 21st century. Once the sand was locked down, water was delivered, and the soil began to recover. The remote western deserts of China, such as Xinjiang, Ningxia, Gansu, and Inner Mongolia, were becoming one of the agricultural centers, contributing more than 30 million tons of farm products every year. One of the most striking examples is grapes. In Turpan, where there are more than 3,000 hours of sunshine each year, and extremely large day-night temperature differences, grapevines accumulate up to 40% more sugar than in typical temperate regions. Unlike traditional cultivation, many vineyards here use elevated trellis systems, precision drip irrigation, and the technique of burying grapevines underground during winter to protect them from severe cold. As a result, this area alone produces nearly 1.5 million tons of fresh grapes and 350,000 tons of raisins each year, making it one of the largest high-quality raising centers in Asia. China did not stop at food alone. It also made the barren desert begin to bloom. In the arid regions of Gansu and Ningxia, thousands of hectares of industrial roses have been planted for essential oil, rose tea, cosmetics, and dried petals. The dry climate helps reduce fungal disease, while intense sunlight increases essential oil concentration in the petals. For some rose varieties, it takes 3 to 5 tons of fresh petals to distill just 1 kilogram of essential oil, making the value of each hectare far higher than many traditional food crops. That turns roses into an ideal choice for lands with scarce water but a need for high economic return.